best of friends. That's good to see as this all ends. I never could latch on to hope that's in a song somebody wrote. I'll never write, I'll leave no note.
Welcome, dear listeners, to tonight's broadcast of Forgotten Embers. Remember, if you have been given the frequency of this channel, you are sworn to secrecy. Our survival depends upon it. And now, to the news. Our broadcast tonight will be somewhat different to our normal programming. Recently, as I am sure you will remember, the Bishops of Dema put on a television show for the entertainment of their citizens, performed by a new band entitled 21Pilots. Why, you may ask? Are we returning to discuss once more the blatant propaganda which our bishops forced down our throats? Well, because earlier this week, as we were preparing for the evening broadcast, an unmarked package was discovered in our studio. Inside was this single cassette tape. On one side are written the words, "Implicit demand for proof," and on the other, "Fall away." After examining the contents further, we discovered that these titles appear to refer to two previously unheard songs. After communicating with our contacts outside the walls, it was confirmed that this is likely part of a lost album from that band, 21Pilots, an album which our bishops do not want us to hear. But what is perhaps most mysterious about all of this is the fact that this tape didn't just contain recordings of those songs. Each track is followed by what appears to be commentary about the song. We don't know where these tapes came from. We don't know how it got into our studio, and we certainly do not know who provided the commentary. But we do know this: the bishops don't want us to hear these songs. Let us listen. Implicit demand for proof. The first song on the first album that opens 21Pilots' discography. Now, Tyler Joseph has said time and again that the openers of their albums are very carefully selected. The openers of their live shows are very carefully selected. The song which opens a body of work or a particular project is placed there with real intent behind it. And while it would be unfair to place the entire weight of the discography on this one song, given that at the time it was written, it wasn't being placed in front of the 100+ other songs which were to follow, it is perhaps therefore more impressive that it's still, despite not being necessarily the best song on this self-titled album called 21Pilots, it is a very strong opener to a very strong album and has withstood the test of time in a number of ways. But before we launch into a full breakdown and examination of this song, the lyrics and meaning and message it contains, and the story that it tells, let us take a step back and consider for a moment the history and context of not only this opening track, Implicit Demand for Proof, but also the entire self-titled album, which we are about to launch into a track-by-track exploration of. Now, unfortunately, given the fact that this was the band's first album, and they didn't have any significant releases before it, for instance, some bands predate an album with an officially released, widespread release of an EP. There was an EP of sorts, a sort of promo CD, we'll get into that in a minute, but it wasn't a major release. It wasn't treated like an official, full-fledged EP release almost an album release. This really was the first collection and body of work that they released, put together, put on a CD as a collection of songs. And so, of course, at this time, the band was in relative obscurity. They had some fans, but not a huge number. And given that it was almost 27 years ago now that this album was released, if my math is correct, and again, given that the band was pretty much unknown at the time, and the fact that social media was in no way as prominent as it is today, so that even the fans the band did have were not really discussing it online, it is almost impossible to find any accurate information about the history of the band from this time period. This is a problem that we're going to see time and again as we look at each of the 14 songs on this album. As much as I would like to have a thorough historical analysis of the song, and by that I mean simply the context in which the song is written in terms of the band's history. You know, what other projects they were working on the same time, who it was who actually worked on these specific songs, the place and role that they played within the band's career, that's something that we'll see more and more as we explore the rest of their discography. But for these early albums, and in particular for this self-titled album, very little of that context is known. And again, the band wasn't really known, so the release of this album wasn't predated by any promotional singles or anything like that. And so, despite fairly extensive research about this period of the band's history, although I'm ready to admit that perhaps there are things that I missed, I was only able to find a few definitive details and only able to speculate on a few other details. But here is roughly what we do know. The band was formed in either late 2008 or early 2009. Again, for context, this particular album was released December 29th, 2009, so right at the end of 2009. And the original lineup of the band consisted of 3 members, not the 2 that we know today. Tyler Joseph, who I'm sure you're familiar with, Chris Solly, the drummer, and Nick Thomas, the bassist. Now, Nick Thomas and Tyler Joseph knew each other previously. In fact, they had met several years ago, I believe in high school, perhaps even earlier than that. And Nick had actually helped Tyler work on his EP, the sort of lost project No Fun Intended, of which there are very few physical releases in existence, although some were handed out once this band was formed, and the digital releases which do exist have inconsistent track lists and a lot of conflicting accounts of what songs were actually on that collection, and in fact, how many songs, and if some of those songs were written much later, and so on. That's a whole other conversation. It's not the topic of this series, but it is interesting to note that Nick Thomas and Tyler Joseph had worked together on music before this band was formed. And then, from the best of my understanding, Chris Solly met Tyler in college, or around that same time period that Tyler was in college, and together they formed this band. And the 3 of them, along with 1 or 2 other friends that they had, were renting a house together. And it was in this house, in fact, in the basement of this house, that they put together some sort of makeshift recording studio. And it was in this basement studio, this sort of makeshift do-it-yourself recording room, that this album was created and recorded. And at the time, they were really just working on putting together songs to perform them live. They weren't thinking about releasing album after album, having album cycles, again, as I mentioned earlier, having singles or EPs come out. They just wanted to have songs to play live. And so one thing that's interesting to remember in this time period is that while these 14 songs were the ones which were gathered together into the self-titled 21 Pilots album, released in 2009, a good number of other songs also existed. The exact number is unknown. I don't know if anyone today actually remembers, unless they kept some meticulous notes, how many songs were in existence besides the 14 gathered here. And certainly they had some other covers as well that they would often play live. But those other extra songs that didn't make it onto this album ended up being recorded and put together on an album called Regional at Best, which was their second album in 2011. Again, not the topic of this portion of the series, that's something that we will revisit when looking at that album down the road, but another piece of interesting historical context, that these songs on the self-titled album were written alongside many of the songs on Regional at Best, and in fact, alongside some songs which ended up on their first debut studio label release, Vessel. Trees is one of the songs which I know for sure was in existence around this time. I believe Ode to Sleep and maybe Car Radio were as well, alongside some others. Now, according to interview appearances, which both Chris Solly and Nick Thomas did with this podcast called the 21 Pilots podcast, which was recorded sometime around the Blurry Face era, 2015, 2016, I forget exactly which year. But those episodes are both available on SoundCloud. I would definitely recommend going to listen to them if you are interested in hearing more about the history of this early period of the band's time together. But according to Nick and Chris, Tyler Joseph was the one who wrote the lion's share of this album. They came in to add their particular musical parts, such as the bass and the drums, but even the drums were programmed through something like GarageBand or equivalent program that Tyler was using in that basement studio. Then as we approach December of 2009, so remember most of this is taking place in either late 2008 and into 2009, as they're in this house together writing and recording and starting to play small shows and gathering songs together to play at these shows. So then as we're approaching the end of 2009, in either October or November, most accounts seem to say October, but some out there do mention November, which is why I include both dates. Most likely it was early October that this event took place. The band performs at something called the Battle of the Bands. And it was at this event that they began handing out some promo CDs for this upcoming album. And the track list on that CD is interesting to take note of. There were 4 songs on this CD, and they are as follows: Johnny Boy, Air Catcher, Time to Say Goodbye, and Friend Please. Now, those of you who are diehard fans will probably notice that one of those songs stands out among the others, because the third that I mentioned, Time to Say Goodbye, is not actually included on this self-titled album, and in fact is not included on any of the albums in their discography. It is, not strictly speaking, a cover. It samples another song, Time to Say Goodbye, which is, I believe, an Italian piece. It's a beautifully written song, but I believe they didn't have the rights to every part of the song because they had sampled someone else's work in it, and so they couldn't release it on any of their official CD releases. But it was part of this early promo CD release, and it was available to listen to, and I believe still is, on an early version of the band's SoundCloud account. And then the set list for the Battle of the Bands event, according to what is reported online, consisted of 5 songs: Friend Please, Fall Away, Trapdoor, Johnny Boy, and March to the Sea. This particular song, Implicit Demand for Proof, was not included as part of the set list, and in fact, from what I've been able to find, was rarely performed live, and certainly is not one of the songs on the self-titled album, which has been brought into their later shows and re-performed live, unlike some of their other ones. Songs like Fall Away, that we'll see later, Addict with a Pen, of course, even Trapdoor and Isle of Flightless Birds have been performed more frequently in recent years. This one, Implicit Demand for Proof, has not. And when exactly the song was written, again, is unknown, but given that the band formed somewhere around the turn from 2008 to 2009, and this album was released at the end of 2009, it stands to reason to assume that this song was written sometime during 2009. Again, the exact month is completely unknown. It is also not clear when the debut performance of the song took place, although again, I think it is reasonable to assume they did play it live at some point, given that that's the reason they were writing most of these songs, was to play them live. They weren't really writing songs strictly to put them on an album, but it is not known when they started playing this one in shows. So with all that context in mind, as sparse as it may be, let us now turn to look at this song itself, to examine the lyrics within it, the message behind it, the story that it tells. It is quite an interesting way to open this album, and an interesting way to open the 21 Pilots discography. Because of all the songs by 21 Pilots, this opening track is one of the clearest depictions of Tyler's struggle with faith and belief, a topic and a struggle which we see explored time and again throughout the rest of their discography, but never as clearly, in my opinion, as we see it explored here. And in this song, Tyler appears to be experiencing a desperation, which is starting to bleed over into anger. He feels that he has become completely separated and alienated from God, and begins to lash out at him as a result, demanding a sign, even if the fulfillment of such a request would be the end of him. Now, compared to some of the other songs on this album, there's not a surplus of lyrics. In fact, the majority of the runtime of the song is taken up by a musical intro and breaks. But the lyrics that we do have are quite telling, and this first verse, in its entirety, is a call to God. Again, Tyler here has reached such a point of desperation that he wants any kind of sign from God, any kind of indication that he's still there, his presence is still near, even if such a sign would be destructive to him, be a punishment for him. He's reached a point of feeling so alone and distant from God that he wants any kind of proof, even if it means he will be struck down and destroyed in the process, even if that proof is the last thing he experiences, even if that relief of no longer being alone spells the end for him. And so we get these lines: "Strike me down, I am calling your lightning down from your dark hiding place. Go ahead and show me your face. Even the second part of those 2 lines continues this theme. There's a passage in the Bible in which God tells Moses that no man can look upon his face and live. And I think it's interesting to bring that in as some context here, given the Christian background of this song. So let me read that portion quickly. And again he said, "Thou canst not see my face, for man shall not see me and live." That's Exodus chapter 23, verse 20. So again, this idea of willing destruction upon himself in order to just have any sign from God continues with that simple line, "Go ahead and show me your face." That in of itself would be an act that could destroy Tyler. But, as you may have noticed, I looked at the last 2 lines of this first verse first. And there was a reason for that, because the first 2 lines of the verse present this in a particular way. Because the second 2 lines seem to present such an extreme doubt that it requires a self-destructive proof to be able to remove that doubt. But the first 2 lines of that verse seem to present a Tyler who not only still believes in God, he even still trusts in him. The entire song opens with this phrase, "I know you're not a liar." And so, if Tyler knows for sure, with the certainty that that first phrase, that first clause seems to betray, then it seems that Tyler would also know that God is still faithful even when he can't see him, even when he is in his dark hiding place. And in fact, all of this does have an implication that Tyler still believes God exists. He's calling upon God to rain down and destroy him, as we'll see in the chorus in a moment. But how could God do that if he no longer exists? And so we have this weird balance where Tyler both believes in and trusts in the existence of God. He trusts in him to not lie to him or deceive him, but he still feels abandoned by him. Or at the very least, if it isn't that God has abandoned him, Tyler himself has removed himself so far from God that he feels alone and desperate for any sign. So as I mentioned a moment ago, I kind of gave away the chorus because it is simply "rain down and destroy me," repeated several times, and then that chorus itself is repeated several times throughout that song. But unsurprisingly, the chorus holds the sort of core of what the song is talking about, this idea of wanting destruction, wanting this destruction rained down on him, right? Not just a potentially destroying sign, not just something that which could be so intense, such an example and a proof of God's existence that could be so intense that it could threaten to destroy Tyler. No. A proof which is so overwhelming and clear that it is rained down upon him in such a way, to such an extent, that would necessarily destroy him. But then we move into the second verse, which goes as follows. And I'm going to read the whole verse in its entirety this time, unlike with the first verse, but then let's take it line by line. Verse 2, "I mean no disrespect. I'm simply very perplexed by your ways. Why would you let us use your name?" And we'll get to that last line in a moment because it's a bit of a sticking point for me. But going back to the first one first, "I mean no disrespect." It seems perhaps that as the song has gone on, Tyler has begun to soften a little bit. As I mentioned when introducing this song, there's a sentiment behind all of this of a feeling of Tyler lashing out at God, feeling anger and desperation. I've used that word over and over again. He's desperate. And in his desperation, he's acting in a disrespectful way towards God. It's almost like he's been yelling for the first half of the song and then he stops and says, "I'm sorry, but help me understand. I'm frustrated by my lack of understanding, but perhaps being frustrated and responding in anger is not the way to go about understanding things or removing my doubts." And as the verse goes on, as we saw, this idea continues. "I'm simply very perplexed by your ways." It's not just that Tyler is struggling to feel God's presence, feel close to him, no longer feel alone and distant and separated. He also doesn't understand why he feels that way. And perhaps that is one of the most frustrating parts for him. One of the reasons why this has been such a struggle, one of the reasons why he is lashing out in a disrespectful, angry way. Because he feels alone and feels like he has no understanding of why he's alone and therefore can have no clear vision of when this loneliness, this separation, this distance from God will end. Because he doesn't understand why it's existing in the first place. And he's falling into a greater doubt than perhaps he otherwise would, a greater loss of hope than he otherwise might experience if he did understand why he was alone in this moment, or God felt distant in this moment. Because again, as we've seen throughout the beginning of this song, he feels like he's reaching out to God. He's calling upon God for a sign, for something that will indicate he's there. And he's getting nothing back. And so in verse 2, he almost shifts to a different tactic. Shifts into that sentiment of, I believe, but help my unbelief. Help me to understand. I still trust you, I still want to respect you, but help me understand so that I might have better hope. And then that third line, I mentioned we would come back to it. I mentioned it was a sticking point for me. And the main reason why it's a sticking point, and this kind of ties into the very beginning of all of this, when we were discussing the sort of lack of historical context for the song, part of that is there isn't an official lyric booklet for this album. There are CD reprints of the album, but they don't contain an official booklet because even I think the official CD that was released maybe had an official booklet, maybe didn't, but it's really lost to the sands of time. But the line here that I'm finding, and the line that most sources seem to have, is, why would you let us use your name? But the line I always heard was, why wouldn't you let us use your name? That simple word, not, very much changes the meaning of this line and adds a different spin and different context to it. The sentiment behind why wouldn't you let us use your name, though, does seem to make more sense to me, because it is yet another theme which we see explored in Exodus. Just like God in chapter 33 told Moses, no man shall look on me and live, earlier in Exodus, when he first appears to Moses through a burning bush, he refuses to tell Moses his name, saying simply, I am who I am, or I am who am. And so there could be an idea that part of the reason why Tyler is so perplexed by his ways, perplexed by the fact that God feels distant from him now, also ties into this idea of being perplexed as to why he's not allowed to know God's name and feel the closeness to him that such a personal thing would bring, right? Knowing someone's name has a certain level of personality to it. Even though a lot of people know a lot of people's names, it is obviously more personal than someone being completely anonymous. Others have suggested that the reasoning behind it being, why would you let us use your name, is to indicate or play upon this idea of not understanding why God lets humans sin. It's a little more complex, but basically the idea is using God's name in vain is a sin, but giving humans the ability to use God's name in vain, while at the same time it being a sin, is perplexing for some. Regardless, no matter which way you understand or hear that line, it is an interesting part of this song, and continues upon this theme of Tyler being perplexed by the way God operates, which ties into the whole sentiment behind the song, the whole story that we see here of Tyler being frustrated and confused because he feels distant from God. And then as the song goes on, it just goes back into the chorus and then the outro, which continues the same line as the chorus, rain down and destroy me. But comparing verse 2 to the beginning of the song that we see in verse 1, really there are only these two verses to compare, with the chorus holding the core of the song but not necessarily continuing the story of it. Comparing that second verse to the first, it seems as if, like I mentioned, Tyler is softening and perhaps his anger and frustration towards God is lessening. He is in fact acknowledging that he mainly just feels confused, and perhaps it is the confusion and perplexity that he has surrounding his faith and what he believes that has created a situation in which he feels as though God is distant from him and has abandoned him. But just because Tyler is confused does not mean that God is in fact not real, or that Tyler fully doubts that. Like we saw at the beginning, he knows he's not a liar. He knows he's hiding somewhere. He knows he has the ability to rain down and destroy him. And as we'll see as this album continues, Tyler continues to explore and wrestle with elements of faith and feeling alone and distant from God, and trying to understand, strengthen his faith, and bring himself closer to him. And then in other songs, we see a more general wrestling with the darkness, with his doubts, with his lack of hope, and his search for the light. And so I look forward to exploring the rest of these songs with you in these coming episodes. Welcome back, dear listeners. We are now coming to the end of tonight's broadcast of Forgotten Embers. Next week we will be taking a look at the second song which we were given as part of this mysterious tape, Fall Away. It is worth mentioning that we are still not sure who sent this package, or how it managed to get inside our supposedly undiscovered broadcasting room. But, for now, we can only hope that whoever it was has only our best interest at heart, and will not do anything that might risk our exposure. Remember, listeners, if you have been given the frequency of this channel, you are sworn to secrecy. Our survival depends upon it. We are banditos. We renounce vialism. We bid you good night.